Okay, so for those of you that don't know me, I'm Dr. Gorman. I'm one of the adult neurologists in the clinic. So I'm just going to give an oversight that follows on from Yi about the current trials, so both internationally and also ones that are actually ongoing here in Newcastle. So this is really complex, and don't worry, I don't want any of you to read it at all. But what I want you to see is that recently Prof and I have really reviewed all these studies that are ongoing worldwide. And these are all the studies that are ongoing worldwide for patients with mitochondrial disease. If we click to the next one, there's 2 studies within this group that are actually active, ongoing now for certain forms of mitochondrial disease here in Newcastle. And I'm just going to speak a little bit about those. And we do have one representative here if anybody wanted some further details. So Yi slightly touched on this. One of the studies currently is using a drug used a long time ago for high cholesterol, as well as high triglycerides in your blood, but we know it's really good at making mitochondria in muscle. So we wondered, is that potentially good for patients with mitochondrial disease that specifically affects muscle? So muscle weakness, difficulty exercising. And this study is currently ongoing. Hannah Steele, is she here? Yes? Okay. If Hannah could stand up, because if anybody has any queries or would like to participate, please go to Hannah. But I know several of you here in the audience today have actually already participated or are actively on this study. And it's a study over 12 weeks, taking the drug at first the usual dose, as you would have got it if you had high cholesterol, and then a second phase where we're using higher dose to see if we can get even better benefit. The next study is led by Dr. Patrick Wyman, and I know quite a few of you here have seen Dr. Wyman. This study is very specific to one form of mitochondrial disease, and it's those of patients who have Liebers, optic neuropathy, so present with blindness due to one specific gene. So again, it is quite a small group, but here they're actually using that technology that Yi was talking about, to use a virus as a little transporter to manipulate the genetic material and try and produce healthy mitochondrial function. That's ongoing here and recruiting actively in Newcastle, but as I say, it's only for one form of mitochondrial disease, one specific gene. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here today, but I'll give you his details at the end. The next bit, Prof has already alluded to, and I'm going to take you through where we currently are, because I'm sure you're thinking, well, we got it into legislation last year, we could do mitochondrial donation, but where are we at the minute? And obviously mitochondrial donation, as Prof and Dr. McFarlane have already shown, there was a baby born in Mexico. And obviously we have been doing a lot of work here to try and get this into practice, both developing the technique and making sure we can get it introduced both ethically and with equity. And that means that everybody has an opportunity to this treatment. How are we proposing to do this, to introduce it into the NHS? Well, we want to establish it as a treatment in the NHS. And as you can imagine, that's not easy. I'm just going to take you through a few slides again. I don't expect you to read this, but I want to show you what we're trying to do as we try to get this introduced into the NHS. Right from the start, we'll run a clinic of reproductive options. That means if you know you have the condition or someone in your family knows they have mitochondrial disease, you will come to a reproductive options clinic. It doesn't mean that you'll opt to have mitochondrial donation, but we'll talk to you about all your reproductive options. And we hope to offer that even to very young women so that they can start thinking right from the off what choices they actually have. Our plan as a group is to ensure that every woman has all the options available to them. As you can see, these pathways are quite complex. So you don't just turn up in a clinic and we see you and then we pass you on down to the Centre for Life with a decision of what you're going to do. These are quite complex, and every box represents a step in the pathway. And I would say we've probably worked on this for over a year with quite a few of you here in the audience to get this right, of your clinical pathway. So you won't just turn up to a clinic and someone takes a number and you go in and see someone. We've thought about how this is going to be introduced. Our aim the whole way through is not just about the health of the baby, but the health of the mummy, because we realise that most mothers will actually have mitochondrial disease themselves, whether they're an asymptomatic carrier or they may actually be affected. And we want to make sure that we don't just follow up the babies born with mitochondrial donation, but we also look after the mums at the same time, ensuring that they have a healthy pregnancy. Because a lot of you help Sister Feeney at the back do a questionnaire before looking at complications of pregnancy, and we know that women with mitochondrial disease have more complications than women who don't have mitochondrial disease. So we've taken that into consideration as we develop the pathway. We don't or won't just look at the person, but we'll also look at the donor, and someone asked about this. We will screen the donor for mitochondrial disease as well. And then that will lead on to the next study that we envisage will come here. And this will be led by Dr. McFarland. And this is when we get permission to do mitochondrial donation, that this will go hand in hand with a study where we will look at all the children born from the technique and follow them up at least to 18 months. And as you can see, they'll be very extensively checked along the way, but not medicalised, because a lot of you said to us, you don't want your children to be medicalised if they get access to mitochondrial donation. But what we'll make sure is just that they're developmentally healthy. And I suppose that's where we think is really important, that we follow up, not just when you have the procedure, but that we also take care of the children, as I say, as well as. So the next part that we're looking at is future trials. And what is on the horizon? Because I would say the last decade has been very much about making a diagnosis of mitochondrial disease. There's been a huge explosion in genetic testing. I'm sure a lot of you had mitochondrial disease, and it took a long time before you were actually diagnosed. So I'd say the last decade has seen a huge explosion in diagnosis. But what are we doing with that information? It just doesn't stop there. We're using it to help inform what we're going to do in the future. But that's not the only thing. We've very much changed our approach as how we design studies. We very much get your help. There's quite a few of you in the room today, not just yourselves, but family members have been very generous in helping us with this, because we now do a lot of focus group work, and a lot of you are involved today. My slides have even changed from this morning till now because of our focus group, because of some of the feedback. So everything we do with future trials, we want to make sure it's what you want, that we're targeting the right things and we're doing it the right way. Because the only way we're going to get treatment, through all the legislation so that we can get it out there into the NHS freely available, is if we can prove it works. But we can't do that without your help. When we went to as a group, the three big things that come across was the main overall problem that most people have is fatigue, tiredness. And if we had a magic cure tomorrow, if we could cure the fatigue, that would be brilliant. Second thing is communication, how we communicate to our other allied health professionals, to other doctors, to physiotherapists, making sure that there is a pathway of communication. And I think that really leads to knowledge about education, that you're desperate that we educate. What's very frustrating, if you go and see somebody, particularly a doctor, and you say, I've mitochondrial disease, and they go, oh, very good, what's that? Never heard of it, but still don't push themselves any further to go check what it is. And we have been striving really hard to try and improve that. And with your help, it definitely is getting better, because we do have a lot of queries now coming through. It's great to see that people contact us when you're admitted or your family members admitted, so we can at least try and help them and advise them, because we do realise it's complex. But they would, I'd say, they're the three things that have come out of a lot of our focus group that would be the top three things that we're trying to change your work on. That led to a mission statement about our research and how we take this forward. And this was changed, as I say, pending the focus group today. But what we want to do is make sure that the care you get in clinical practice, we equally give that same level of care when you take part in a clinical trial. That to make sure the outcomes in any trial are important, we ask you, you know best. So there's no use if I said to you, well, I can make you walk an extra metre if that's not important to you. If your big problem is fatigue and you say, if I could just have an extra hour where I'm not sleeping. So very much we're changing the focus of what we're doing to try and make sure any study we do, it's actually with you in mind, what's important to you. And the whole thing is about involvement, is about asking your opinion and changing the way we do things. Not just asking, oh, very good, but asking and changing. So we are very much influenced by every feedback that we get from you. And I would say that's probably the most important thing we're doing at the minute for future trials, because that is helping us design our future trials and where we go from here. So I can direct you to these two websites, which that first very busy slide was on. There's two real websites which give you all the clinical trials. But I think what's really interesting, and I actually scribbled it down because we had feedback from a patient about going to these clinical trial sites. So there's two ones. One's Japanese and one is the main American one, which we in the UK all register studies with. But someone said, I went on the website covering clinical trials. I found it very disappointing, the number of trials that said no results published. And you think, oh, poor so-and-so, who's took part in that? I'd really like to know whether it worked or didn't work. To explain to you, there's a lot of regulation about what you're allowed to put on these sites and what you're not. However, I absolutely agree, because having, as I said, did the review, we've gone back month after month and there's no update because there's no facility for update. And perhaps that's something we as a group in Newcastle need to approach these sites about, where we actually say to them, irrespective of what the stage of the study is, they can at least tell you how many people are involved and where the study's at. So I think even from today, that's quite a good take-home message. If anybody wants any further information about any of these studies that I've discussed, there's Hannah here today. Patrick E. Wyman has given his email address if anyone from the Liebers study, so the gene therapy. And obviously Dr. McFarland is here if anybody would like to speak further about mitochondrial donation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to just ask Dr. Gorman a couple of questions. So Bronnie, there are a couple of potential clinical studies coming up. So Dr. Gorman's working on one particular study. Do you want to just kind of give a flavour for two things? One is how much that study would cost, so that people realise just how much these things cost. And two, about how many patients you would hope to enrol in that study.
Yeah. So while Bobby and Doug were in York yesterday, I was in London, and hence why I couldn't see one of our patients who come yesterday. But so I was down at one of the funding boards, and we've got through the first round, but obviously you never just jump one hoop, you have multiple to jump. But the study itself that we're proposing would look at treating 120 patients, again with a drug a little bit similar to bisafibrate, but potentially works more strongly at making mitochondria for muscle weakness patients. We're looking at about 120 for that study, and the cost is 1.8 million. So these aren't small. But when we say we are designing a study, as Prof said, I mean we, because we were one of the first groups ever to take it to this board where patients actively helped us design the study. And yesterday, for the first time, it was my first time at this meeting, but the person who came down from me, quite senior from the university, it was the first time that they actually said to the group, could you please make sure you run this past your patients? And it's never been heard of because we're supposedly the first, but it's changed the practice of this grant board. But they're not cheap. And that's, they are very expensive. And obviously, but the only way we can get those drugs into market is proving that they work. So we do appreciate there's a lot of time commitment from yourselves, but the reason for our focus group today, what we're trying to do is design it that we get the right outcomes, we're targeting the right things, but we try and condense the studies that it's a little bit more manageable if you're working or you come from outside Newcastle.
Okay, and the second question I just thought would be helpful. We are working provisionally with an American drug company at the moment. Do you want to just say a little bit about that? I know it's early, but
yeah. So this one is exceptionally early, but it would be really interesting because this would be a study looking at multiple sites. They would be looking to give treatment not just for one single type of mitochondrial disease, which is really exciting because I think, as most of you realise, sometimes these treatments are only targeted at certain forms And it would be really nice if we could open this up to loads of forms, particularly those rare forms of mitochondrial disease. Still very early. They're currently looking at a therapy that would be given as an injection. It's still in its very early infancy, but what would be quite good is that they not just look at the treatment, they also want to look at the different forms of mitochondrial disease, try a bit like us, and I think, dare we say, we looked at it and they're learning from us, that you have to ask the right questions. So again, what is it you want to change? And they're very much looking at fatigue, tiredness, as well as all the other parts of the condition. And then they're looking at the outcomes, because the only way you can prove these drugs work is you have to have strict outcomes. You have to have something that you can measure, and they're now looking to try and make sure those fit with patients with mitochondrial disease, because there's huge measures out there, but it doesn't mean they're appropriate for mitochondrial disease. So the first phase of that study will make sure that the outcomes are appropriate for all forms of mitochondrial disease, and that could be at least 600 people eligible. And then there's a second phase of a drug study where it looks like it will open up to a significantly larger number of patients here in Newcastle, but with multiple centres throughout the world.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think it would just be helpful to give an idea that I know a lot of people here have signed up to be part of the MRC Cohort Study, which is just a registry which gives us some idea of how many patients there are with mitochondrial disease. Dr. McFarlane runs that, and that's currently about 1,300 patients, of which about 850 are from Newcastle. To give you an idea, there is probably about 13,000 patients with mitochondrial disease in the UK. So it just gives you an idea of the general number of patients with mitochondrial disease, but the importance of developing up drugs and potentially the cost, because I don't think people quite appreciate it. One drug, to test one drug in 100 patients costs 1.8 million pounds. So these are not cheap, which is why we've got to try and choose the right drugs to try and take to bring forward. Yes?
That 13,000, those people are registered as having mitochondrial.
1,300.
No. Those 13,000 are in it, right. So Dr. Gorman and Dr. McFarlane did a very careful study in the northeast of England. So we know pretty well how many patients there are in the northeast of England, and they have magnified that up to represent the whole of the UK.
Oh, I see.
Right, so many of these patients might not know they've got mitochondrial disease. We've just been very active in going out and seeking that in the northeast of England. So it's a slightly, but that's a sort of number that you would expect.
That's the sort of number, right, okay, thank you.
Any one at the back?
Yeah, I thought someone might ask about that. Officially, there isn't at the minute. So Bobby and I were actually in the States when were we? About June time. And even then, there was supposed to be an announcement of results from that, and there was nothing actually presented. I know that one of the representatives is still looking at the data, but as yet, there's nothing official back on that. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, just one thing they're looking at. There was a study using API 743. Unfortunately, that drug failed to meet its primary outcome measure, so that the measure by which they were assessing success of the drug, it didn't fulfill that criteria. They then opened up the trial to extend it, and what they're looking at now is a different measure, and that measure is the number of hospitalizations of people who are taking the drug. Is that different from people who are not taking the drug? Now, there are arguments for and against using that as an outcome measure. Probably too complicated to go into just at the minute at this lecture, but there are reasons why it might not be a good measure.
Just so we know, how many drugs were on your list of being tested at the moment?
15.
So 15 clinical trials throughout the world. I think in 5 years there'll be 50.
Yeah.
So it is going to change.
Yeah, so 15 in total, where probably 12 aren't replications of the other. So yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So we definitely think that we're only starting, and there will be an explosion of studies. And I think, as Prof is saying, our best thing that we can do is collaborate with everybody, collaborate worldwide, because there's, you know, there's power in numbers, and that means that the more we, you know, make sure we collaborate with our colleagues in the States and the rest of Europe, I think it's really important, because it's only then when we come together where we really find specific treatments for the different parts of the condition. And as someone said today in the focus group, you know, they don't just want treatment for them. What they would ideally have is that, you know, you could prevent anyone developing symptoms, not just mitochondrial donation, but if you're an adult, that if you know you carry the mutation but haven't symptoms, that you could stop that as well. And it was something, you know, I thought was equally as important as what we're striving to do.
Just to add one further thing to this international collaboration, many of you are members of the cohort we have here in the UK, and there are 1,325 people on that cohort now. We're actually looking to internationalise that cohort and collaborate with colleagues in Germany, Italy and the US, where they have similar sized cohorts, and that will give us a real magnitude to the number of patients we have on the cohorts who could then be recruited to studies and give us an opportunity to study mitochondrial disease more generally across a broader spectrum of people.
Okay. Any other points? Yes?
Where would you access the information? Afterwards, yeah, I'm happy to put this information up on the website. The mission statement all will go up. We can put the clinical trial sites up as well, and we can do the summaries, so all the talks will go up on the website.